Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm doing my 14.23 ADC Tierlist. So if you enjoy content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were a couple of changes this patch. The two big nerfs were to both Caitlyn and Kog'Maw. We saw some slight adjustments towards Jinx and Smolder, and then we saw a very small buff towards MF. But let's get into the tier list. So the D tier is going to consist of the same two champions. We have Kalista and we have Twitch. Twitch is by far and away the worst ADC in the game at the moment. He lost his AP fallback pattern a while ago. They nerfed his AP ratios and it's basically non-viable anymore. They've then nerfed Bork, they've nerfed him, they nerfed his ult damage, which was quite a big part of one of his strengths in the previous split. They actually took a decent amount of power out of that, and over time he's just not really received the love he needs to kind of bring him back up into the meta. His builds are kind of weak at the moment. He doesn't really have any other options outside of Bork. You can tell Wild Arrows looks to be slightly underperforming. Collector relies on him snowballing, and obviously that got nerfed this patch very slightly, but still does hurt the item a bit. Overall, he's just very underperforming, not something I'm really going to recommend. In Kalista's case, she's a very hard to pilot marksman who is pretty reliant on synergies to really get a lot of value out of her. If you kind of meet the criteria of this champion, she could definitely be powerful. Like, her early game strength is definitely there, spikes really nicely on 1 and 2 items with like your Bork Ginsu's pairing, and there's definitely good value to this pick, especially if you put the time in, learn the champion, play it with the right pairings. I'd have it as a slight tier above Twitch, especially going into the higher ranks, but as this is mostly focused on mid to low elo, it's not a pick I'm really going to recommend at the moment. The C tier is going to consist of relatively similar champions. We have Tristana, who is slowly making back some of the ground she lost from the update she received. They obviously micro-patched her after the changes to try and push her out of mid lane. The overall kind of gist with Tristana is she scales a bit better, her gold scaling's a bit better, they've nerfed down her wave clear, she's not going to be quite as oppressive early on, and yeah, she's definitely doing a bit better in the bot lane now. Still kind of under the bar, but yeah, there's definitely a bit more strength to it. Still wants to be able to snowball quite aggressively, still looking at like a collector rush as being her main core item. Lucian has been underperforming for a while. Obviously he kind of took over competitive and they nerfed him primarily because of that, like your Lucian Nami pairings, and then even Lucian mid for a bit. In solo queue he's always been slightly below because of his high skill ceiling and the value you can get out of his champion's mid game, which is where his oppressiveness usually comes in. His early can be strong, especially if you're rotating consistent stacks of the passive, pairing him alongside aggressive enchanters or aggressive engage supports. There can definitely be like value to this champion, but it's still not a pick I'm really going to recommend unless once again you are very comfortable on this champion. Samira's really bad at the moment, a pick I am also just not going to really recommend. She's very predicated on getting early advantages, closing out games before she falls off eventually, because her power mainly comes from being able to stack up her damage and then stack up her ult and then use that to obviously output a lot of damage, and that progressively becomes a lot more difficult if you ever fall behind the curve, or the later you go on into the game, where your champions usually end up with better tools to kind of shut you down and just not really allow you to get those angles. Overall, the collector nerfs once again were a slight tap down to her, weren't big by any means, but she's definitely been on the decline for a while. Zeri has been on the rise. She obviously has both Yuntal Wild Arrows and Static Shiv as options she can go. The changes to those two items really did kind of elevate her back into a spot where you can kind of play her if you're comfortable on her. Obviously, she does have a relatively weak early game. That is one of the biggest weaknesses of this champion. But if you get like your 1, your 2 item power spikes, like you fully stack your Yuntals, then she could definitely be valuable and pairs quite nicely along both enchanters if you're looking to be like a really strong hyper carry, and even like engage supports. Like, you do have access to decent bursts with like your fast E and your WR combos. She can like output a lot of damage really quickly, so there's definitely value to this pick at the moment. Varus has kind of gone off both the tankier and the lethality variants. You're looking more towards just primarily playing an on-hit variant of Varus, which has definitely hurt him. Having that variety kind of taken away from him definitely removes some level of fallback pattern. But the on-hit build did get buffed more recently. They buffed the W flat damage by 3. That did help him, and it enables the fact that the Bork nerfs in the previous patch, well, I'd say previous patch like 2-3 patches ago now, did hurt him. overall, he's gained back some of that. Bork, Ginsu's, there are some other variants and like other items you can flex in, and you can usually build relatively durable later on into the game, especially like your 4 or 5 items, as you get access to a lot of base damage, and Bork can oftentimes carry you through the mid into the late game. Moving down is going to be a Aphelios. Collecting Earths once again slightly tapped him. He probably shouldn't. I probably slightly overrated him, having him in the B tier. I still think he's in one of the best spots he's been in a long time. If you do want to play the champion, he still scales incredibly well. His early game can be quite powerful if you're spacing effectively and utilizing weapon rotations. There's definitely a lot of power to this champion at the moment. He's still very hard to play, and getting a lot of value out of this pick can feel quite taxing. And oftentimes, it can come down to your support synergies and like the lane kind of situation to where you're really getting this champion's value from. And he can still be quite vulnerable as a low mobility, zero mobility marksman rather. Not having access to that gale force anymore does really hurt his ability to function in teamfights, especially if enemy has a lot of dive and you don't have like great pill tools. But yeah, I'm going to drop him down from the B tier back to the C tier. Moving up to the B tier is Smolder. We've seen some different build variations. I know a lot of people really like the Hubris variation, but you can still go like the Essence Reaver first. It's not going to suddenly be non-viable. The other options look to be slightly weaker though, other than these 2 items, but things like Shojin can still function as like a second item, and there are like different routes you can go with this champion, but it looks to be slightly positive for bot lane, and then slightly negative for top and mid lane, where you are no longer going to be able to utilize the fact that he could just perma clear waves. You now have to get a lot more gold, and oftentimes abuse the fact that the champion's just been pushed more towards gold scaling and less about just getting his stacks and just sitting back and scaling, which hurts mid and top more than anything. Other champions here are going to be Kaiser, who is still, I mean, it's just slightly underperforming compared to where she was pre-passive nerf stacks. The static shift changes ended up being relatively neutral for her, but yeah, she's kind of gone from being like an A tier pick to a B tier pick. She can still very much carry games and still can be quite potent on like your 2-3 item power spike, with like your mid game being quite oppressive, and you do have the fallback pattern of like an artillery style build with the W. That is definitely something there for you, but champion, kind of sits towards the low end of the B tier at the moment. Ezreal has a really high skill ceiling, very demanding of like consistently rotating skill shots, utilizing auto weaving, which can be skills you learn over time. Like, you don't need to have played a ton of Ezreal. It's more a case of just knowing, like having good game knowledge and then being very comfortable landing skill shots and just understanding the champion. But if you do put a lot of time into Ezreal, he can be very rewarding. Definitely one of those champions which can really jump up the tier list depending on how much games you put into him. Xayah comes down to being a bit more situational, but the W buff she received a while ago did help her, did kind of reignite her as like an option within the bot lane. I still wouldn't recommend her as like a default option, and like you don't really need her in your champion pool, but she can be really nice into heavy dive. She's one of those champions which has a really great self-peeling tool, which is very valuable as a marksman, where you can output a lot of DPS and then utilize those self-peel tools. Draven is, I would say, slightly better than Samira at the moment. He's still obviously going to be quite hard to pilot and is very demanding of early game aggression and snowballing, and some games you will just fall behind and feel relatively non-impactful, as this champion needs gold to really like function as a mid and early game marksman. He will fall off later compared to other champions, even though his damage output is still very high and can still be valuable, especially if you get the peel and you're able to consistently rotate axes. But a lot of champions do outrange him. A lot of champions can output more DPS faster than him, but he does still have some of the highest damage in the game. Like landing 2-3 axes can oftentimes comfortably kill someone, especially later on into the game. Yasuo and Vayne wrap up the beta. In Yasuo's case, he tends to perform a bit better in the bot lane. He is obviously a very good answer into ranged champions. His high mobility can make him quite impressive here. Pair him alongside an engage support with a knock-up, and you have a very powerful champion. We've seen some different variations of Yasuo in the bot lane, whether it's like your Halo Blades, with like Sudden Impact, or like your Fleets, your Grasps, your Lethal Tempos. There's loads of different trees accessible to you, and then like obviously the builds can consist of like Borks, your Krakens, your Yuntowers. But there's a lot of ways of playing this champion, and he can function quite well as a bot laner. Obviously, you want to put a lot of time into him, and more often than not, Yasuo's bot is going to be played if you like autofield from mid to bot, and you have already got a good amount of games on Yasuo. Otherwise, you're kind of learning him fresh, learning him into the bot lane matchups, which will be different compared to obviously playing a marksman, but he is a very powerful pick to have within your champion pool. In Vayne's case, they buffed her more recently. She's a fine bot laner. I know a lot of people really dislike Vayne in her current state, obviously primarily because she lacks wave clear and she can feel quite bad to play into a lot of the ranged matchups, which oftentimes can just be more oppressive than her early on. But her isolated 1v1 potential, and if you're ahead of the curve, her team fighting can be quite potent. And it can make a real menace on side lanes, especially if you have like the accessibility to do that. She will oftentimes, just be outright beat most champions on side with her high mobility, high single target damage. And yeah, she's really valuable in that aspect, so I would have her within the B tier at the moment. Now, Brand is a champion who could drop down to the B tier. The main thing holding him up in the A tier at the moment is just how easy he is to play, and although he oftentimes needs things like Yanami to really like synergize within the bot lane, he can still function with your engaged supports and have value in that aspect. But yeah, you're oftentimes not playing Brand unless your support has shown what they are going to play, and that can definitely, like, obviously limit the amount of times you're playing him. He very much relies on the enemy misplaying and not dodging his skill shots to output the most amount of damage he can do. But he has great DPS, he has great wave clear, he's very easy to play, and I would say they're all strengths which can, like, really merit the champion. Would I say he scales into high elo? No, not really. Like, Brand has really lost that aspect with the consistent nerfs towards both jungle and solo lane power, and yeah, I'd say that has primarily like meant that he just isn't going to really function in the higher ranks, like once you go like Diamond Plus, for example. Ziggs is within my A tier. He was better in the past and then they nerfed his tower sieging potential, but he's still good in that aspect. Like, the damage of this champion combined with his siege, still very valuable and can definitely be something you can play for and like a win con of the champion. But he's going to be a bit more inconsistent than some of the other mages, and obviously not going to output the same level of DPS as most marksmen, especially later on into the game, unless you're really ahead of the curve. And I'd kind of like tag points off of him for that reason. The other mages are still all here, like your Vigars, who is very good in low elo, but then quite aggressively falls off the higher up you go, really utilizing the fact that people don't dodge skill shots and you can quite comfortably stack in bot lane. Combined with the lane and like some of the synergy pairings, he can be quite valuable here. Would I say he's a pick you can blind in a lot of circumstances? Probably not. Like, you're going to want to pick him a bit more situational, probably depending on what like support matchup is and whether you can get a lot of cage value into some of those shorter range compositions. He can definitely function there, especially if like you're able to go a more bursty orientated build. Lux also going to move in the A tier. Obviously, still supports some level of play rate within the bot lane, which honestly surprises me. Like, I don't really see Lux bot lane, but she is a very popular champion, so it would make sense that she would have some bleed through into a different role. Support Lux still like the most popular champion in the game. Mid lane Lux is up there, and yeah, bot lane Lux has great burst potential. I think this champion's really underrated at the moment. The wave clear, the scaling, if you stay ahead of the curve, like, she does need gold. Lux will struggle considerably later on in the game if you don't have gold on this champion. And yeah, I think bot lane's a great place where you can play her. Pairs really nicely with a lot of the support options. If you're able to consistently chain your damage with someone else, you can, one-shot ADCs quite comfortably, and that is definitely a very valuable aspect of the champion. In Karthus' case, he's always been a very strong bot laner, being able to pair really nicely with CC. His ultimate is an incredibly powerful tool. The single target damage, if you're able to land your Qs with like isolated, is very oppressive and can oftentimes be quite deceptive for the enemy champion when playing against him. I do think he's slightly prohibited by the fact that some of the nerfs he received more recently, but obviously he still has strong itemization. If you're getting a lot of gold on this champion, he can still be one of the best options accessible to you in the bot lane. You do want to put some games into him though. Like, you're not going to be able to just first time Karthus and like instantly nail him. He does have a skill curve, and once you kind of master him, yeah, he's a very good option and something I would definitely recommend. Even into the higher ranks, people just won't really understand how to play against Karthus that well. And yeah, oftentimes you're able to get comfortable wins from that purely from his nicheness. You do need to be obviously aware of what your support's playing. If you pair him with an enchanter, it's going to be useless. But like, Nami's obviously the exception. But like Nami, Leona, great pairings for him. And then some of the other engage options are also really nice to play alongside the Karthus. Sivir is really underrated at the moment. This champion's definitely found her footing after her changes more recently. I do think as a pretty easy to play marksman with great accessible wave clear, she can be very valuable as a bot laner. Great DPS later into the game, good hyper carry potential, good harass with Q. I think she's just in a pretty solid spot as like a good jack of all trades champion. Ashe, obviously, the premier utility marksman. The slows combined with the ultimate give her a lot of value outside of lane. Even if you fall behind, like she has a fallback pattern, which most ADCs don't really have, as they are just losing more DPS and they don't really have like the CC, which Ashe does. Her ultimate, yeah, great pick tool. Her W and her early game power can all be very, very oppressive, and she can definitely function as a great champion. If you fall behind though, then yeah, you're a low mobility marksman, one of the slowest in the game in fact, and that can definitely be quite punishing. But yeah, E, R, W, all great tools, especially in those mid to late game scenarios. Hui is one of my favourite mages you can play in the bot lane at the moment. I think this champion has a plethora of tools accessible to him, which can be utilised in many different situations. Does have a skill curve, obviously. Having 9 abilities does end up requiring a lot of game knowledge and like situational awareness of what you need to pick. But like the main builds of like your Blackfire torches, your Ludens, your Cosmic Drives, some of your more burst orientated options. There are just loads of ways you can play this champion, and yeah, he's in a really good spot at the moment. I really do recommend this champion as a high A tier. Honestly, like if you put a lot of games into here, he could be S and even like S plus in the right situations. MF and Jinx both sit up at the top of my A tier. MF actually gained quite a bit on the mana cost reduction on her Q. She looks to be, yeah, doing a bit better. Obviously, I would recommend moving towards like BT and Youmuu's after the... Well, I mean, Youmuu's got nerfed as well. So I'd recommend actually BT as being like a solid rush option. Both Youmuu's and Collector are still both very solid options for you. But yeah, Collector getting slightly nerfed, Youmuu's getting slightly nerfed. Youmuu's looks to be slightly more performant anyway. There are options accessible to you. It really comes down to what you need within the game, whether you need that movement, the damage. Collector's build path can be quite nice with the dark within it. In Jinx's case, she got slightly adjusted. They took away some of her W's total AD ratio, put it back into her base AD gain, so she's getting more damage out of like her autos, for example, rather than just the raw W damage. And yeah, it's looked to be slightly positive for her. She does have like different build options, like your Krakens, your Yun Towers. There are things she can go, and yeah, she looks to be in a pretty good spot. A very good A tier champion. I mean, with some of the other ADCs being nerfed, like your Kog'Maws and your Caitlyn's, and Jhin obviously taking a bit of a hit with Collector being nerfed, Jinx is in a really prime spot to like jump up to the S tier, and yeah, in low elo especially, where you can consistently snowball more often than not. She is in a very good spot. Moving on to the S tier then, we have, actually I'm missing a champion here. Corki drops towards the low end of the A tier. The nerfs he received more recently were kind of targeted towards low elo more than anything. He had his both his AD and his armor scaling go down slightly, I believe, and yeah, that's going to be more of a low elo nerf. As games go on longer, you're getting access to more levels. In high elo, it's not going to do as much. Corki's still a very oppressive laner. That is where most of his power lies, so he does like shift towards the lower end of the A tier now. Moving on to the S tier, we have Seraphine, who is still a very solid mage option in the bot lane. Great enchanter aspects, with the W and the CC can be very valuable on her. Obviously, her damage is lower now. They nerfed her QAP ratio by 10%. That does hurt her. Like, it hurts her wave clear quite considerably. But she still does a lot, and that can be really valuable, especially as like a major option. Once again, with most mages, you're not really going to play them every game, but they are a great choice, especially when the kind of like stars align and you can really like they can be enabled for the most part. Nyla is a lot more conditional, but she's received a couple of tweaks more recently. This champion obviously synergizes really nicely with like your Tarax and your engage supports, where you can really, well, I mean, I say engage supports, some of the more niche supports like your Sennas, for example, can pair really nicely with Nyla, where you're getting more value out of that heal and shield on the passive, healing and shield power on the passive, and the Shed XP can be quite nice with specific supports which want access to those levels, so they can get, maybe their like level incentives are a bit better. She can definitely shine in those aspects, but as a champion, she still has great burst damage, she has good sustained damage. The main weaknesses do come from her lack of range, and she can get harassed out of lane, especially if you're not pairing her alongside the likes of an enchanter, which can be quite nice in those lanes where you are going to be taking a bit more harass, and yeah, you don't have the tools to really fight back. Kog'Maw took a bit of a hit this patch. He kind of, actually all three Kog'Maw, Caitlyn and Jhin are towards the low end of the S tier. In Kog'Maw's case, the AP build looks worse now. Like, you should probably just go back to playing the on-hit variation more often than not. Obviously, the AP build is good in the games where you are solo AP or you need that range rather than your consistent auto attack play pattern. So it is a fallback pattern. It's just no longer going to be the default way of playing him. Bork into Ginsu still looks really good though. Still probably locks him as like a good S tier, but yeah, the AP variant looks to be more like an A tier build now. Caitlyn had 50% of her total AD ratio taken off of her ultimate. That was a pretty big hit. It does hurt her ability to chunk people out, and she's no longer as consistently going to just be able to kill people with that ultimate. The collected offs also did hurt her, but she still stays as a relatively good marksman pick, which scales quite aggressively. Her AD game is obviously also very oppressive, pairs really nicely with CC supports, where you're able to rotate trap combos and burst people down, oftentimes just being able to one rotation someone. In Jin's case, he's a bit safer, has access to obviously a bit more CC, slows, and like it has more utility than most marksmen. That's mainly what I'm trying to get at here. Obviously, his DPS is considerably lower than most other marksmen, which is where he does falter a bit, but his damage is very high. Being able to utilize effective combos with like specific supports can really benefit him, and that can definitely be quite a good reason to play the champion, especially if you are looking for someone with a bit more range, and you can kind of afford to go down the route of playing Jhin. Swain is probably my premier choice this patch still. He was the last patch. He maintains that spot. The Blackfire Torch Cosmic Drive build looks to be the best way of playing him. However, he does have other options, and people are trying other things, like we've seen Ryle Fimbulwinter in the top lane, I believe, specifically, which might have started seeing play in the mid lane as well. Obviously, you don't need to go that kind of build. You can just play standard, same kind of builds every single game, and you should be able to have relatively similar results with those builds. Obviously, he's a bit more comp dependent. You want short range compositions where you can utilize your ult more effectively and your closer range tools. But he, with the buffs, has definitely found his footing as a really good bot laner. The best in my opinion. You could argue he should be S tier because of the fact that he's a bit more conditional, but I believe the champion is so strong right now that you can play him into almost every situation and still get good results and still be relevant to an extent within the game. So yeah, I'm going to leave him there for the moment, but I would like to know your thoughts on Swain, because obviously this champion is in a relatively interesting spot. He is like a 4-way flex pick. He has obviously more recently been reworked, and I know lots of people are like testing things with him and seeing what really feels comfortable. But yeah, those are my thoughts. So thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.